I'm Dan. Thank you for having me back again. I'm looking forward to embarrassing myself on stage for a second year. A little bit of a primer. Let's see. Who here has heard of the Verizon DBIR report? Wow, like 3 people. Great. Okay, if you've never heard of the Verizon DBIR report, check it out. It's really awesome. Verizon has this department of folks that basically they just hoover up all the data they can get on all the breaches that they have seen or have been submitted to them over the last year, and they put together this really colorful report with all sorts of rad graphs and charts and stuff that say, here's like the top 10 ways that bad guys are getting in, here's the top 10 techniques they're using. And so if you're a defender or if you're an attacker trying to pretend you're another attacker, like if you're like doing my thing or you're on the red team, you want to emulate what the real world threats are. The Verizon DBIR report is a really good resource for that. And from that, these are the figures from 2021, so they're a little old, but they haven't really changed. 90% of all the breaches that they have recorded involve some kind of perimeter exposure or perimeter breach, which means if you're in the world of just put everything in the cloud and make everything an EC2 instance and they're all online, well, that's a lot of hosts online that I can see, which means the attackers can see, which means they become targets, right? And then there's some figures with regards to costs and things like that. A third of all incidents are $1.5 million to remediate. 75% of all incidents have a follow-on legal cost of dealing with the courts and the fallout and all that fun stuff. So back in the Triassic area, the prehistoric area at a time when I used to ride my Triceratops to work in my loincloth, there were servers in a data center, and at the top of those data center racks there was a firewall and then a switch, and then below that equipment, like physical stuff you could go into a data center and touch. And I know that this makes me 7 billion years old, and this is like unheard of crazy nonsense back pre-YouTube era, before time existed. And back then there were firewalls that people used for stuff. At some point, the internet started getting really popular, and some people decided, you know what, we're going to take VMware and we're going to sell VMs attached to the internet, and that sort of developed into the cloud. And then so as the cloud happened, this happened. They were like, okay, well, now you have these machines that are directly plugged into the internet. You have Windows machines directly online because that's safe. And we ended up with this, and they said, okay, well, so that's bad because if you recall, again, back in the Triassic area, a Windows XP being put online directly had a lifespan of something on the order of 20 to 30 seconds before it was infected. And they said, that's bad. Let's do this. Let's put a cloud dashboard in front of all of that stuff, and we're going to have a whole bunch of people that have never touched networking and don't understand how packets work, design a UI for people to do firewalling in the cloud. And that went really, really well. If you were around for that, I'm sure it probably involved lots of drugs and maybe banging your head against the car or the ground or jumping off a building or what normal people do when they encounter a cloud dashboard. And so that was complex and confusing, and people thought, this is stupid, we don't like it. So they turned it off. Because, of course, what are you going to do? I'm not going to read the manual. I don't read my logs. Why would I read a manual, right? And so now we're back to square 2, I guess, where now we have a bunch of machines online that have no firewall and have no protection, are directly connected to the internet because the cloud dashboard was too hard. And so at this point, we're getting into the whole CI/CD pipeline stuff, right? Because back in the day, 2005 or so, we were using CF Engine at the time, the company I worked for. And CF Engine was like an SSH-based solution that did push, right? So if you wanted to deploy CF Engine and its configs to a bunch of machines out on the internet or on your LAN or whatever, they expected that you had SSH open and you would use, ideally, keys, and you would make that SSH connection, and then it would basically run commands, just shell scripting, essentially. There's lots of manual stuff. It worked, it was great. But in this circumstance, now you have Jenkins, Bamboo, CI/CD stuff, file stores, test servers, all of your dev machines that for some reason never get logged. All that stuff is just online with no protection of any kind. It's just on the internet. And so this stuff normally would have lived in an office network, but because cloud, it doesn't anymore. It lives in the cloud and it's completely public. So the stuff that you would expect is in an infrastructure that's being protected in some way by like a NAT gateway or some firewall rules or something is just completely public. So it gets colorful and interesting because anyone can see it. And so in practically every scenario, and this is where it starts getting colorful and interesting, is that in an organization, in most cases, the same people that manage the infrastructure inside the network also manage the infrastructure outside the network, or that bridges the gap. If you have like a data center or a DMZ or an environment where you have stuff that's supposed to be exposed to the public because you're offering services, web stuff, mail stuff, an API, doesn't matter, whatever. There's stuff that's exposed to the public. And so it may not necessarily be the same human beings. It may not necessarily be the same department, but generally speaking, if you're talking about a corporation or organization, the decision of how to handle computing infrastructure as it relates to touching the internet all rolls up to like a decision maker or two. And if you find that the outside of the environment is full of dumpster fires and like burning things and that sort of stuff, you can expect that the inside of the network will be very similar, often worse, because if it's on the public internet or exposed to the public internet, the general consensus is, oh, well, it could get attacked, so we might need to lift at least the tiniest finger to try to secure it in some way. So in short, essentially, evaluating a company's perimeter is a really good way of identifying like how they handle themselves with regards to security and their posture, as far as what they think is safe and what they think isn't. So a really good example is if you look at the outside perimeter of an organization and you see like Tomcat 7 point something's admin interface, or like IIS 8.5, or you know an F5 appliance that hasn't been patched in 10 years. Chances are incredibly good that the same people that left that stuff to gather dust connected to the perimeter have left a ton more on the inside of the network. And so you get a really good idea of like how difficult it could be to go after an organization based on what their perimeter footprint is. And so I can't really put my finger on why, but for some reason, at some point, people decided that network diagrams were dumb and stopped making them, which is silly, I guess, because it's way easier to understand like your environment if you can draw a picture of it. Like if you can draw a picture of your environment, it's really easy to see like, oh, this is where the packets go, and this is where like stuff talks. So another thing that I don't really get with this sort of concept is that cloud vendors have made it expressly difficult to make network diagrams of your infrastructure. Like if you've ever, raise your hand if you've ever killed a bottle of whiskey because you were trying to map an EC2 environment and couldn't, right? Like I'm not alone in this. And so if you can't draw a picture, I mean, I guess in some ways, it's like, this is the silver lining, is if you can't draw a picture of your own network, then it's very challenging for attackers to draw a picture of your own network. But if everything's in one giant VPC on one broadcast domain, who cares? It's all just in a pile on the floor. But yeah, like being able to draw a picture generally means what you're drawing is the freeway system that is your environment. You're drawing the networking connections between services and servers and equipment and things like that. And you get a better idea of how packets flow and where they go if you can draw a picture. So it's really, really handy. Yeah, not sure exactly why that is, but here we are. And so you've probably heard a lot of discussion from security people about network segmentation. And these discussions usually involve some kind of breach where an attacker gained access to a system and then they were able to move around laterally inside of the environment because there was nothing in their way. We have that now, except it's just public because these machines are just on the internet with no protection, no firewall, no anything. They're just some box with a publicly routable host online. And so these are two things that were in the news fairly recently. If anybody remembers the Verkada breach from a couple of years ago, the same researcher that did the Verkada breach did the commuter air one. And the commuter air one, same thing, they're both identical. Publicly exposed instance of Jenkins, no credentials to speak of. You aim a browser at an IP, and you get their Jenkins install. And if you're not familiar with Jenkins, basically the easiest way to think about it is it's a clumsily built trebuchet that launches you into a ball pit full of shells. And so, yeah, you just swim around in there, and it's just root on everything. And the Verkada hack, it was basically cameras that ended up in, like, Cloudflare's lobby and SpaceX warehouses and Amazon warehouses and like all sorts of places that you wouldn't expect like accidentally stumbling into, but it was like Jenkins install on the perimeter to layer 2 adjacency to a bunch of cameras that had an SSH maintenance backdoor, and the credentials were in Jenkins. And so it was just like, boop, boop, hey, I can see like them building rockets now. Okay. And so this one with the commuter error was very similar, except instead of like boop, boop, rockets, it was like boop, boop, the no-fly list. And that made the news, and it was a very big deal. And so as we zoom out and we look at why on earth does this keep happening, it's because what we have been able to assert is that like everybody wants the newest, sexiest, coolest, most expensive possible thing. We want post-quantum, crypto-breaking, quantum entanglement hardware that does polymorphic, malware and AV evasion and EDR and all this fun stuff, and they're wheelbarrowing money and gold bars in to buy all this stuff. But over here on the left, they're like test.php, where if you just add like $CMD equals ls, you get a root prompt, and it's like, you guys, maybe you're not doing it right. And so like more and more, to Tomer's point, if you got a really good idea at like how some nation states are handling their attacker infrastructure, it's written incredibly haphazardly. It's just ultra donkey mode garbage fire the whole way. And like while everybody is distracted with like, let's jam everything into ChatGPT now that we're done with jamming everything into blockchain, like that's how yeah, it's a thing. This is why we drink. But right, so like if somebody drops like semicolon reboot into the field of some fancy appliance you just bought and the thing reboots, then that's usually a bad sign. And so like the top, it's always in the last few years, one of the top 3 ways that attackers are getting in is because of like perimeter breaches. And those numbers are just going up. It's getting really silly. And most breaches can be prevented these days because in large part, again, to Tamara's point, it's not necessarily exploits that are being exploited, it's just bad config. It's like people that don't know what they're doing, putting stuff on the internet and like crossing their fingers and squeezing their butt cheeks together and just hoping really hard that they don't get hacked, and it doesn't really work. And so if I think really hard, maybe the last time that we used an actual exploit on an engagement was like 2018. Like maybe, so it's been like 5 years since I've had to think about actual exploits, because it's just like test.php, lol, I'm in, whatever. But it's like that everywhere. It's kind of wild. And so like if you're in the cloud, it doesn't necessarily mean that like the cloud is going to do your security for you. Like a Linux box is a Linux box. It doesn't matter where it lives. Like if you don't know how to work the Linux box and you don't understand networking, then like you're going to have just as difficult of a time whether it's a physical piece of equipment or whether it's a VM in the cloud. And so it gets colorful fast because the trends are changing in how people deploy stuff to the internet. It's making it a lot easier for these mistakes to happen. And so again, a box is a box. Doesn't matter if it's cloud or not. The architecture should reflect that. But so the intention here is essentially, if we sort of zoom out, is from the blue team side of things, you want to expose as little as humanly possible. Because if we all agree knowledge is power, then you're giving the attackers knowledge by telling them everything about your infrastructure, by putting all of your infrastructure online and letting anybody just see it. And so like, for example, one really hilarious piece of reconnaissance you can do is to just look at SSL certificates. If you look at SSL certificates, depending on who deployed them and where they go and what they're doing, some of them will leak subject alternative names. And if you look at those subject alternative names, you'll get like internal naming conventions and internal domains that aren't supposed to be public. But because the company deployed a CA, they put one cert everywhere, and that one cert is supposed to be for the internal test QA, whatever dev version of the same thing as the external version. They're like, meh, let's just use the same cert. So they put all the domain names in one cert, and they put the cert everywhere, and guess what? Now you're in cert.sh, and now you're in Census, and now you're on Shodan, and now you're everywhere I look when I find this stuff. And so the more I can see as an attacker, the more the real bad guys can see, and the more they learn about the organization before they break in. And it makes it really, really easy to conduct like phishing campaigns and to stand up like evil twin lookalike infrastructure and assets to ensnare employees or to phish executives. Because if you know what the employees are seeing, then you can reproduce it. And essentially, it's like a shell game. So the big sort of takeaway is what we call asset value asymmetry, which this was kind of an enlightening thing for me when I learned about it. As described by Alex Gantman on I think this was Mastodon, actually, because nobody should be on Twitter anymore. A paper written by Bruce Schneier and a bunch of other people in 1999 covered this example of asset value asymmetry, which I was like, this is genius, I love it. Essentially, think of like a grocery store chain, right? Grocery stores tend to have shopping carts, and the shopping carts are valued at somewhere on the order of $100 per shopping cart. Well, shopping carts will get stolen by people, by homeless people, by kids doing whatever. Like, they just disappear, right? And every time a shopping cart disappears, it costs the grocery store chain, call it $100. Well, if they install those machines that you have to put like a coin in, like a quarter or a pound coin or what have you, or a token you buy or get from the, a machine inside the store, you can't just walk away with the carts anymore. They stop disappearing. They stop walking away. And so what that basically teaches us is that the attacker doesn't think that a shopping cart is worth a coin, but the defenders think that the shopping cart is worth $100. And so you have this asset value asymmetry where like the defenders believe that there's value to this thing and the attackers don't. And there's a way that you can turn that on its head and exploit that, which gets very hilarious very fast. To impose cost on attackers is actually a lot easier and a lot cheaper than you think. And if Tomer's slides were a really good example of how the attacker's infrastructure tends to work, it becomes almost Benny Hill-esque in terms of its comedic value for how to mess with attackers if they're coming after your equipment. This is a lot of fun discussion with regards to people that end up jumping back and forth between blue team to red team, because every time you make that jump, you take little nuggets of intel and knowledge back and forth. You figure out how the blue team does stuff that makes your red team better, and you figure out how the red team does stuff that makes you blue team better, and you just do that forever until like it's all the same thing and it's all just this purple goo. Because we're all working on the same infrastructure and equipment, we're just looking at it from two different angles, but at the end of the day, it's like the same thing, right? And so like, making life difficult for attackers is probably something that I imagine will get a lot more attention in the near future, as it's considerably easier than I thought. And so here's a really hilarious, well, not really hilarious, but this is a point of contention for a lot of people who live in the DevOps world, where you have like a control tool. In this case, you have something like Ansible or CF Engine or what's another one? Puppet, Chef, these sorts of things that use like SSH as a basis to like, you have a whole fleet of machines out on the internet and you want to like push config to them, you use a tool like this. Well, in easy mode is you just open SSH on all of these machines and then you just do your push, and the server end pushes config via SSH to the receiving end. Well, the receiving end, it could be passwords, it could be keys, but architecturally speaking, there's like one sort of source of truth, and if you control that one source of truth, then you control the rest of the fleet. And in a lot of cases, that's one phishing exercise away. Like if you can get the admin who runs that component of the business to fall for a phishing campaign, not only do you get their machine that is the admin of their entire EC2 or their Amazon account, you get all of their credentialing and you get key logging and whatever. I mean, you control their machine. It's the equivalent of pushing them out of their chair and sitting down at their workstation after they've logged in. You can kind of do whatever you want because now their machines are now your machines. And it gets even more colorful if they're using something like keys, because then you just steal the keys. And who is actually putting firewall rules on all these machines that are connected directly to the internet? Not as many people as I would like to see. And in multiple instances, when I have done these sorts of red teams, I gain control of that key. And if I have control of that key, I control the entire fleet. And so I can RM the entire fleet, which that would be bad, but I could like install miners on that whole fleet. I can turn it into, a spam cannon. I can use it to do impersonation and use your imagination. You just got a new 3,000 node deep Linux fleet of machines because you have one single SSH key. Like, use your imagination. And so from an architecture perspective, if you use a pull architecture instead of a push architecture, all these host machines are reaching out to the server and pulling down config. So you can say, you could use like for example, one of the, what do they call it? An overlay network, like Nebula or Zero Tier or Tailscale or something to that effect, where you have like no actual open ports on the internet, and you're running that operation over that channel, and if anybody finds one of these hosts and scans them, there are no open ports. And so from an attacker's perspective, there's not a whole lot you can do. And the host isn't actually telling you anything. You can't tell, like, unless there's a DNS name attached to it, if it's just some IP, like, there's nothing to go on. And so you can't tell as an attacker, do I spend my time on this resource or not? Because you don't know. But yeah, I remember there was one really hilarious story. In 2005, I was working for Anonymizer, and we were using CF Engine at the time, and it was using a push architecture. And we were deploying code to web servers, and one of the web servers kept getting compromised. And CF Engine runs out of cron every minute. And one of the things you can make CF Engine do is check for file system changes. And you can say if any files change that are not specifically mandated in the CF Engine config, revert them to their previous model or mode. And so it was really hilarious watching people break in somehow, drop files into like the web root, like a web shell or C99. I don't even think C99 might even be too new for that. I can't remember what it was, but it was some janky PHP web shell. It would get dropped, and they would start doing their ops, and then the whole directory would get deleted. And then they would do it again. And after 6 or 7 tries, they just kind of gave up. And it was just fun watching. Like, we didn't even fix the bug that was letting them in, because it was funny watching them get frustrated and walk away. And it's like, hey, we can mess with these people, and it's not expensive. Like, you don't need to drop $500,000 or $1 million on fancy pants, new crazy equipment. Like, literally, this is like a couple of command lines in Bash, and it just turns into this hilarious, like, these antics. Right? And another piece of ancient forerunner technology, if anybody's ever heard of a tool called fail-to-ban. This thing is probably close to 20 years old, maybe 25. It is really, really simple. You install it out of something like apt, and out of the box, it looks at your SSH logs, and it does basically, it does thresholding, where it looks at like auth.log and says, oh, some IP address failed login 5 times in a minute, or 5 times in 2 minutes, or what have you. It adds them using IP tables to basically a null route that says that host can't talk to the IP anymore, and so it just goes away. They can no longer contact it. However, it's fully extensible since it's literally reading text files and then doing whatever generic action you want, and so you can make it do all sorts of interesting things. So, for example, you can use it as sort of a universal adapter. Like, you can have a look at DNS logs. If you're actually running your own DNS servers, you can have a look at web logs. Like, a really, really hilarious thing you can do is to say, if you're getting brute forced, right? If you're actually looking at your, like, say, Apache or Nginx logs, and you're getting, like, maybe the red team is after you, and they're doing a directory enumeration on one of your servers, and you see them doing that. You know, what's a directory enumeration look like from the blue team side? Well, pages and pages and pages of 404s. So you say, okay, failed to ban. Hey, look at this log. And if you see more than, I don't know, 10 404s from the same IP in like 5 seconds, add that source IP address to this text file over here. And then you have another config file that says, anybody in this config file gets a different version of the website that's full of like trapdoors and zip bombs and iCar strings and Benny Hill nonsense and like Rick rolls, like whatever. And or like a symlink to itself, if you've ever done that in Linux and actually lets you do it, you can basically have a directory that's never-ending deep. And if you've ever run a tool like a web app pen testing tool, and you aim it at a web server, and the customer has like a symlink to itself, you end up in this like black hole that's a million directories deep, but they're all logical. But the tool, it breaks the tool because none of the tools know what to do when you're like, I'm 7,000 directories deep and I haven't found any files yet, but every time I go into a new directory, I find another directory, and that's the only thing, so I go another directory. And it's like, it tar pits the tool. And so now, like, if you're familiar with like Mark Rober and his antics and other folks who are like, our whole bag is screwing with scammers that try and scam you out of money on the phone. If you hang out with them on the phone and take their time, then they can't attack anybody else while you have them. And so, like, this is that, but digitally. Like, this is that, but for attackers out on the internet. And so, like, oh, and then things are getting colorful and interesting now. And so you can go wider, right? You can say, okay, well, I want all of my equipment out on the internet to have a bunch of these different tools installed that do these things that collate together logs, for example, like ancient forerunner technology. Like, if you don't want to give Splunk $10,000 and you have more than a gig a day of logs, you can use syslog like we used to back when we used to write our dinosaurs to work. And you can just have all of your servers collect syslog and dump them into one place and have fail to ban, look at that one place and just do these thresholding rules. And so you can say, if you have like 10,000 servers out on the internet or 5,000 or what have you, and they're all getting pummeled because maybe they all have a web web server installed or they're all listening on SSH, you can collate together all those logs, and then you deduplicate your attacker IPs, and now you have your own CTI resource. You have your own threat intel, right? Like, cool. So I have these 10 IP addresses that are beating up on us. Maybe I tell my colleagues and at another company, hey, these are the known bad guys. And then like now you're kind of sort of almost one of the antivirus vendors that sells that information. So now you don't necessarily have to buy it because you have your own sensors. And again, free, right? Syslog, it's been used for decades. So Apache has a really neat trick that they started doing quite a long time ago called rewrite rules. Rewrite rules are like regular expressions, but they're for web requests. You can make decisions based on web requests, or you can make decisions on web requests based on a whole variety of different things, from like headers to file names to source IP address, like whatever you want. And you can basically configure, this is like the mechanics for the thing I described before, where you have like a text file and everybody in this text file gets like a different version of the website. You do that with rewrite rules. The rewrite rules say if the source IP address is X or whatever in this list, then they get this directory and not the original directory. It's really interesting. And so it works in reverse, right? So like if you're on the red team and you don't want the blue team to find your equipment, you find out what their egress IP address is, which is usually generally pretty easy to find out, and you add that into your infrastructure using rewrite rules to say, hey, if this IP address makes requests, they get this website over here that is all about methodically reinstalling eggs back into chickens, or mustache wax, or whatever the popular thing people are screaming about now is, and not the actual C2 infrastructure of all your equipment that you're using for your red team engagement. And so like it works both ways, right? Because again, it's all kind of this same purple mush, and we all live in the same purple mush. And so like you can use these techniques whatever team you're on, right? If you're on the blue team, you can mess with the red team, and vice versa. And if you're on the blue team, you can mess with the attackers. So like if you think rewrite rules are cool, this is actually pretty neat. So HA proxy is another web technology you can stick in front of things. But one of the cool things that HA proxy does that I don't think you can do this with Apache or Nginx natively, but you can basically say, look at the first few bytes of the packet that comes in and make a decision on where to route the traffic based on like the packet bytes. And so, for example, you can say all inbound traffic on port 443, if it has the first bytes that look like SSH, use this other backend, which is an actual SSH server. And so you can, at the front, designate technologies behind the scenes. So like if you SSH into port 443, you get an SSH connection. But if you hit it with a browser, you get Apache under the hood. And then Apache under the hood, you can use rewrite rules to say if the requesting URI is like /MSF, it gets rerouted to this other port where Metasploit is running. And then you can do that ad nauseum to a variety of other sorts of tools, right? And so when we do engagements, we're running like 4 or 5 C2s all at the same time. And so you can say any traffic that comes in to the front end is wrapped in SSL, so people can't see what the actual URI is. But when HA proxy sees, oh, this is a web request, that goes to Apache. Apache then unrolls the SSL and goes, oh, here's the URI. Oh, this is like Empire, goes to Empire, or MSF goes to MSF. And so you can hide whatever size infrastructure you want behind a single IP and a single port. And so it becomes very difficult to enumerate your infrastructure in that way. And this works, same thing, you can do red team, blue team. The applications are pretty broad. So like, what's that phrase? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, that gets turned on its head, right? If you are the nail, then everything looks like a hammer. So you can automate yourself out of an architecture job, which I encourage you to do because it is quite a lot of fun. You can deploy entire systems this way. You can make alerts and changes happen based on file system changes, like with the CF Engine story I told. You can reroute application layer traffic and all that. Literally, this is like just the sort of foundation. We're talking about like Apache, Nginx, and HA proxy, and it gets wilder from there. Like I really like the term bear trapping servers, which I'll get into in a bit, but that's really fun. And this whole infrastructure, I call it a firewall. Right? Because it's not really a firewall, it's more like a fire. They tried it again. Right? And so you can set honey tokens And this is, I cannot believe this works. I tried it just before I put it in the slides just to make sure I wasn't like completely talking trash. But you can go into like Etsy shells and you can select, or you can make curl-s parrot.lol a shell. So if somebody SSHs into a machine, they don't get a prompt. They get the ASCII version of the dancing parrot forever until they Control-C. Which is really fun if a bad guy lands on that server, because, again, Tomer's slides showed us that these people don't really take a lot of sort of robust coding practices into account. And so if they're making a connection to your SSH server and recording everything they get, they're going to fill the disk with a dancing parrot, like a lot. And it's going to cause a problem for whoever's hacked server that is, because what happens on a Linux box when the disk runs out of space? You're taking attackers' infrastructure out from under them, which is incredibly costly for them because then they have to go hack another box. And it costs you nothing, and all you got to do is sit and watch. It's great. And so, yeah. Oh, yeah, I think I already called. Oh, here, this is a good one. Right, so we go back to that example of like you have a whole bunch of workers and you're gathering logs. You could do this with any logs because it's all text files at the end of the day, right? So if you're pushing everything into syslog and all your syslogs are getting funneled into one collection host, you can then run interesting stuff on that collection host. And if you don't want to shell out a whole bunch of money for expensive tools, or if you're doing an incident response and you need something like right now and you can't wait for the sales guy to give you a license, here's a one-liner that you can use. Like, you can do this on your Mac if you have a Mac, or you can do this on Windows too. There's a command you can, like on Mac, you can just say something and it will like speak to you. And I think you can do this on Windows boxes too, but it's not quite the same command. You can basically say, here's a tail-f command that will read the log, and if I find this pattern that I'm looking for, it will make a noise or say a thing. And so you can like do that off to the side and keep doing something else, and then you'll have like an audible alert go off, which is like an advanced feature you'd have to probably pay people for, but here's a one-liner, you can do it in Bash, go nuts, right? And so like there's a lot of this stuff that happens that we've been doing for 20 years that is basically, it lives under the hood of all the expensive appliances you can buy. So if you were to like rip the cover off of any expensive like multi-$100,000 appliance that you'll find in a rack somewhere, it's probably an unpatched ancient Linux install, probably running kernel 2.4 before systemd, which actually makes it better. Running grep, sed, awk, Apache, fail to ban, you name it. All this stuff is what's living under the hood. And if you know how this works, then you don't need to shell out $250,000 for a piece of kit to do it for you. You just do the one-liner yourself. It's pretty great. So yeah, like if you're looking to improve your swordsmanship, then yeah, you can practice on that gigantic log file that's created if you're collecting all your syslogs in one place by doing all your grep, sed, awk, Perl, Python stuff against that live giant log, because it's a big meaty thing you can go after. So yeah, this kind of works in reverse too, because if you know how this stuff works, you get some idea of like the shenanigans you can pull. If you're on the red team, you can hide from the blue team by like mounting a zip file or an ISO file over a directory in Linux so that when the AV or EDR runs, it looks inside the immutable read-only file system and not underneath it at all the malware you put, right? And so you can like unmount it, run your malware, get that into memory, and then remount it. And then when stuff runs out of cron every 15 minutes or what have you, it looks at the mounted ISO or mounted zip file and not at the directory that you've mounted on top of. And so it's like throwing a blanket over your mess, but it totally works. Right? Another really hilarious one is if you use that -- operator with makedir, you can make a directory that's got a space in it. And that drives people crazy, namely me, when I found it. So I thought, well, this would be a fun thing to use during engagements. But yeah, you can make a directory that looks like a dot, and like spaces don't render, right? And so if you do an ls or whatever, they just find it's a dot. And yeah, it's little things like that, or you can fidget with the file dates to make sure the file looks like it was changed a year ago and not now. And so there's a lot of these. Like if you understand the like Linux fundamentals, you get a little bit like elbow deep into it. You can go very, very, very far. But yeah, yes. Another really hilarious one is making the shell on an inbound SSH connection, something like tmux or byobu, and then recording all of that with like ASCII Cinema or ASCII Cinema, is that how it's pronounced? There's a recording tool that you can install that basically says, record this console live and then the recording can be played in a web browser. And so you can automate the idea of, I have a honeypot out on the internet, it's listening on SSH. When the attackers SSH in, we're using Byobu and Byobu, which is like a tmux, like it's tmux on steroids, to record. Like we're using Byobu as the shell, and so when they get the shell, everything gets recorded, and then we can play it back with ASCII Cinema, and it becomes like a television show, like a clip show. You can watch attackers get frustrated and leave when they realize that like it's a Solaris box and not a Linux box, or like you change the Apache header to say that it's IIS6 and really it's Nginx or Apache. Like a lot of security, it hinges on the honor system, right? You look at the banner of a web server and it says it's Apache, and you just believe it's Apache. And in most cases, it's Apache. But when it's not, things get really fun because different browsers react differently to different user agents and different server strings. And if attackers are looking for a specific thing and they don't find that specific thing because you're lying to them, they go away. Or they know that like these are people are just going to eat up our time. And if it's one of those sort of spray and pray operations, then they won't waste their time on you. It gets pretty colorful fast. Oh yeah, chrootkit and rkhunter are really great if you're just getting into this sort of stuff and you want to see just at a high level, like I want to see file system changes on my machines for the last 24 hours. Like or you can run it out of cron every minute and have it email you, for example, and say like you will know like what was in 2022 the average dwell time of an attacker in an environment before they were discovered was something like 6 to 9 months. Like bad guys are like reading your documentation and like reading all the office gossip out of your email for 6 to 9 months before they get caught. And usually when they get caught, it's because they caused some sort of production outage or they tripped a sensor or they did something that like, oh no, they just pushed the whole water cooler over and I hope nobody would notice. But if you're using stuff like this, you'll notice that they're there within a minute or two. And that's going to be very disruptive. And in most cases, they will probably get frustrated and go away. Unless for some reason they really, really don't like you and they target you, which there's a whole different set of rules for targeted versus opportunistic stuff. So in closing, all of this stuff can stack like Devo hats. Like, for example, that port 443 is the only thing that's open, and you have like 5 different C2s and SSH running behind it is a really cool thing that you can employ. Like, for example, if you have a fail to ban rule fire, you can say, I want a full enumeration of the source IP address that's causing the shenanigans. Like somebody port scans you, great. You do a whois on them, you do a port scan on them, you look them up in Shodan and Census and Binary Edge, and you get all the intel you can about their IP. And then maybe you automate notifying their ISP that, oh, hey, there's some IP address that's causing trouble. Or if it's from a certain country or from a certain region and you know that there's like problematic traffic coming from that region or that network segment, you can then divert it using custom Apache rewrite rules, right? Yeah, combining fail-to-ban logs from 5,000 machines to make your own personal CTI thread. Like, people pay tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for these like thread intel feeds that are literally just like lists of IP addresses. And you can kind of do that yourself for free with just syslog and like fail-to-ban. And it's kind of wild that like people are paying through the nose for this sort of stuff. And yeah, you can like auto-scale with Docker. This is really another hilarious one that I found was like you can auto-scale Docker based on inbound connections. Like you can say if certain environmental rules are present and you have traffic coming in through Apache landing on like back-end hosts that are Docker, you can auto-scale those based on what failed to ban and Apache see, which is pretty great. And then so essentially you can change your, like some advice I have basically if you're on the blue team or if you're on, in SRE land or DevOps land, change your server strings to fake bullshit, like, because why not? Like, who cares if the browser, if you look at the headers for a web server and the server line says, ha ha ha, I can't believe you looked. Like, the web server isn't going to care. The web server, or not, I'm sorry, your browser isn't going to care at all what your server string is. The only people that seem to care are security vendors and attackers, right? If your web server says that you're running, Sun Glassfish and not Apache or Nginx or IIS, like it will change attackers' behavior because, again, all this seems to work on the honor system. If you tell them you're running Solaris, they're just going to believe you. So you should exploit that. If you put something online, it's going to get scanned. Like period, no matter what. If you put something online, it will get hit with stuff. I encourage you to mess with those people. Only expose the absolute bare minimum of anything that you possibly can. Like take some of this stuff to heart, put stuff behind firewalls, put stuff behind VPNs, put stuff behind HA proxy, you name it. Just like as little as you can expose, do that. Put everything behind a VPN. If you think that there's a reason that it shouldn't be behind a VPN, I don't care. Put it behind a VPN anyway. Let's see. The more there is that I can see, the more I can learn about you, and the more that I can learn about you, the easier it is for me to put together phishing campaigns, enumerate your environment, figure out what technologies you use, figure out what you don't patch, what to go after, what good pretexts are, all that fun stuff. And if you tell me everything via your perimeter, then you're going to end up being like the next Colonial Pipeline, Verkada, Commuter Air, Okta, T-Mobile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's me. Thank you for letting me come up here and embarrass myself. That's me on Mastodon, if you're on Mastodon. I'm also the same handle on Wire and on Blue Sky. If you're on Twitter, stop being on Twitter. It's getting weird. I'll be in the crowd. I know the schedule got pushed a little bit. So do I have time for Q&A, or should I jump off? Are we done?
We can do a quick Q&A. Do we have any questions? Anyone? Or you want to find, just grab Dan. He will be here. Yeah. Anyone? No? You want fika? This is the Swedish crowd after all. So there is actually fika in the sponsor area. So we will, a round of applause for a very...
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.